Okay, I get it. But what if I told you the future is going to be very different from what we've been used to? All this talk of economic collapse and civil war and all that kind of stuff will no longer be a concern in like a decade or less.
Okay.
Also, our currently crushing national debt is going to fall to near zero, and without even like a lot of effort.
Unlikely, but okay.
And third, lastly, the ideological wars that we are experiencing today will vanish within just a couple of years from now, and they'll never return again.
You're definitely smoking something.
But that's what we're going to be talking about today.
All right. Let's go.
We're going to be talking about the current dire state of our debt and the social fabric in America. Something called an 80-year cycle of polarization, debt, and war in America. And that there have been 4 previous cycles to the one that we're in right now. And we may be about to enter a 5th one, or the next one, like very soon. Keep in mind, I'm not an expert on economics or history. I'm just reporting on all the data that I've assembled. So let's begin. The crisis of American debt. The debt in the United States surpassed 100% of the economy in 2020 for the first time since 1946. Basically, it's been heading steadily up since like the late 60s, early 70s. And you can see here, second red arrow, it just passed 100% during this latest period.
That's crazy.
Here's a sort of wider, going back to first part of the 20th century. You can see the big World War II one there. And now you can see the red arrow. You can see where that's where we're at again.
And we're going straight up.
Well, yeah, this is the Congressional Budget Office projections. This is our Congress accounting office projects that that's what it's going to look like. This is not somebody trying to scare you. This is just a regular, that's what they think is going to happen. It's kind of weird. This goes all the way back to the beginning of the country, right? 1790 or whatever. Each red arrow is a peak in debt. The fourth one is where we're at right now. Just went straight up just recently to hit like a new record, more than World War II. Now, let's try to get an idea about the size of the current debt. It's estimated at $30 trillion. What does that mean? That means that if you took the combined economies of China, Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom together, that would be the size of our debt.
That's a lot of countries. Some of those have more people than we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's still hard to imagine. No. It's still hard to imagine. I mean, it's... All right, so according to the Congressional Budget Office projections, interest payments alone will total around $66 trillion over the next 30 years and will take up nearly 40% of all federal revenues by 2052. Interest costs, what I mean by interest costs, so like if you think of just your credit card bill, if you had so much credit card debt that just the interest, not what you paid on your credit card bill, but just the interest was 40% of your entire budget, that would be nuts, right? You couldn't survive for more than a month or two, So interest costs for the federal government will become the largest program in the government, surpassing defense spending, Medicare, Social Security by 2049. All of this points to it being completely unsustainable within like a very short period of time. We're not talking like 100 years. We're talking, could be 5 years, because basically once it starts compounding on itself, then you have to decide whether you're going to default on your currency and your debt. And then that's a whole nother world, right? We're talking about the largest country in the world and defaulting on its debt. All right. So, but despite all of this, it's hard to find anybody to agree that we have a problem, the size of it, or even that we have a problem, right? It's kind of nuts.
I mean, the deficit expansion has been dramatic.
Now is not the time to worry about the national debt.
Actually, running budget deficits
is a good thing.
Debt is not something that the general public should be worried about for the time being at all.
That's absurd. Who are these people?
Well, they're the top economists.
Hmm.
Whatever you think of that, but this is obviously not a great attitude to have if you're trying to pay
No,
down a ridiculously high debt.
no, nowhere near it. Do they have any plans to pay these debts off at all? Anybody?
I've looked around. I mean, I've spent hours looking around, and I found like a few.
Oh, okay.
Here's
that doesn't look that good.
here's a few here,
Yeah,
and
they're
I mean, this is like
flatlined.
the best that's out there, right? You got a bunch that are just say it's just going to stay the same, like 100%, and that's like. And then you got there's one down here at the bottom, this green one. It says we're going to reduce it like to like 40% or something.
Mm-hmm.
But
No, there's nothing there.
yeah, and that one was made before the recent huge rise, and I can't even find that one anywhere.
This same.
I went on that website of that company, and they don't. I mean that
Oh, the one that
institution.
brought it down.
Yeah, and they don't talk about it.
Oh,
So not very.
yeah, not helpful, is it? Okay.
Yeah. So basically, everyone's just hoping for this, right? It just stops right where it is right now, and it goes flat forever.
Like that's logical.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How did we get to this place?
Well, all right. Well, the simple answer is we've become a very divided country, which I'm sure you've heard about this. Everyone's talking about this.
Yeah.
We've become a very divided country, and therefore we just can't agree because it's really pretty simple. You got your spending and you got your income, and you just kind of keep them matched. But we can't. No one can decide on the plan for how much taxes and how much spending. So, and then the reason for that is because our politics, our political system looks like this. You may have seen this before. This is the last election. People who voted for the Republican candidate, and then this is people who voted for the Democrat candidate.
That's all cities.
Yeah, but it's crazy that how different they are, right? Obviously, this is a different kind of people, right?
Right.
People who live
right
here,
yeah,
and people who live here. They're going to have different interests. They're going to have different things that they care about. So that's why we can't agree.
Okay.
Right. All right. So you might know something about this as a Canadian. The American system requires 60 votes in the Senate plus control of the House to enact any major legislation. The problem is for the last 2 or 3 decades, neither side has had that level of power. So, everybody, we've heard about this gridlock and all that stuff. Well, that's the reason. So here we are. We're at this place where America used to be the world's biggest creditor by far. Now it's the world's biggest debtor. Right?
I don't get this. Why?
Well, I mean, it's very complicated. There's
Okay.
nobody really knows for sure. You'd think that would be something people would want to know, but is something that people talk about a lot, which is that there's a year where everything seems to all the major trends need to either begin or end, and so people say there's something that happened in 1971.
I was there. I remember that it felt incredibly weird.
For the decades leading up to 1971, the US experienced a ton of real massive growth. Workers went from making $675 a year, or $19,000 in today's money, to more than $56,000 in today's money by the late 60s. People enjoyed paid leave and sick days for the first time, they could pay off student loans, buy houses and cars, and enjoyed a financially stable life. Payroll increased by at least 32% in the 60s alone. Fiber optic cables, LEDs, weather satellites, the heart pacemaker, the internet, DRAM for computers, lasers were all invented in the 60s alone. We landed on the moon. The upper, middle, and lower classes were all moving up together in harmony. But then, 1971 hits, and something really weird happens. The economy kept growing, except it was no longer everyone getting richer together. Now it was only the rich getting richer, and the middle and lower class basically flatlined, to this day.
So what we know is something definitely happened in 1971, and it's difficult to explain what it is, but it basically comes down to this.
A can of soup.
Well, not the can of soup, but the price of the can of soup. So here's the price of a can of Campbell's soup going back to like 1895 up to like 1970. And you can see very little happened to the price, right? It's like
Nice and
9
flat.
cents, 10 cents, 11 cents, but that's it.
I went to
Basically
pick that
10
up.
cents for 100 years long,
I
right?
went to the grocery and got those.
And then starting in 1971, this is what it looks like.
Oh, this is crazy.
Yeah. How can you even? I mean, it's two completely different worlds, right? So now let's look at the price of oil. Here's the price of oil from 1870 to 1970,
Oh my gosh.
right? And here is the price of oil since 1971.
Same thing.
Yeah, it's super, super weird. Now, instead of just looking at like the cost of like dollars, how much to buy something, let's look at like hours worked. That you won't be able to fudge that, right?
No. Okay.
Here's how many hours or how many years it takes you to of your labor to buy a house. So in 1970, it took 2.4 years to buy a house. By 2000, it took 7 years of your labor
crazy.
to buy a house. All right. So so we're not just talking about inflation. We're saying it's getting more expensive to simply live. This is the issue of like what in the world happened in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
People tend to say, if you ask anybody about this, they'll say, oh, it was the gold standard. We went off the gold standard in 1971. And that is true. We actually did go off the gold standard.
In August of 1971, President Nixon interrupted the popular primetime television series Bonanza to announce that the U.S. dollar would no longer be redeemable for gold.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Nixon ended the gold standard to prevent a run on Fort Knox, which contained only a third of the gold bullion necessary to cover the amount of dollars held in foreign reserves. His action of uncoupling the two allowed for the U.S. dollar to exist freely, unbound by the fixed amount of gold in the world.
All right.
Yeah.
So in 1931, President Hoover said, we have gold because we cannot trust the government. 40 years later, 1971, Nixon takes us completely off the gold standard. And he says he's doing it in order to save the dollar.
Wow.
It's all super strange. Then you had a bunch of other stuff happening in the early 70s here. In 71, activists were calling for a new ecology movement. We hear about that all the time today, of course, but this is brand new then. They're calling for sustainable energy use in America.
Mm-hmm.
This was the same year we saw the start of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. It was also the year that Klaus Schwab founded the World Economic Forum.
Great.
So let's look at what happened to energy use in America after, from the 70s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's a chart. That red arrow represents 1971.
Okay.
Kind of hard to miss.
Yeah.
Something big happened with energy. Energy just sort of flatlines. This is per capita usage of energy relative to GDP. So relative to GDP, suddenly we just became incredibly efficient in our use of
that doesn't make any sense. No.
Yeah.
So what actually happened?
Well, this is interesting. If you look down into like how we used energy, it gets really interesting. This chart shows energy used for consumption versus energy used for production. And you can see that for consumption, energy just kind of stayed the same. It didn't flatline. Whereas for production, it suddenly stopped going up. What this means, you look at here, there's even more a breakdown. We've got transportation, commercial, residential. Those are the three on the bottom. Those lines go along just fine. No change. The red line on the top with the little red arrow pointing to it, that red line stops just suddenly and does not change till now, right?
Yes.
And that is industrial use of energy. It just flatlines. What is going on? All right.
Yes.
Um,
So how could American industry just suddenly stop using more energy?
that's the big question. And then, and the question is what effect did this have on our economy, right? It must have
Well,
had some effect on the economy.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's look at it. Let's talk about wages. If you live from 1945 to 1970, you could expect that your earnings would be in line with productivity. Right?
Sure. Yep.
So here's 1945 to 1971. You can see that the red line and the orange line are together.
Mm-hmm.
So your wages are the same as productivity. After 1971, boom.
Wow. That's amazing.
It just flatlines. You suddenly stop getting paid according to productivity, and it just gets worse and worse every year. Everyone's getting less, but the amount of productivity is the same. There were other changes in 1971. It wasn't just that. There's a whole bunch of things.
That's way too weird, though.
For the first time after 1971, for the first time in American history, we started consistently having trade deficits. That red arrow represents 1971.
Yeah.
Boom, down we go. We're into constant trade deficits every year. The federal government also started running federal deficits, right? And here you can see red arrow is 1971, and down it goes. Or now that's what creates debt, obviously, right?
Yes.
Federal government's going to trade into deficit. Now let's fast forward to the present.
All right.
We think that we're a very wealthy country, right?
Sure.
I mean, everyone kind of assumes this is America, right?
Starting to wonder.
If there's one thing we care about, it's money. It's being wealthy, right?
Yeah.
And that is true for the top 5% of the wealthy. That we are still the wealthiest country. But if you look at the middle class and the working class, the U.S. actually ranks 26th in the world, behind places like Taiwan, literally people in Taiwan, South Korea, Malta,
Look at
Canada, Australia. These people are all have a lot more money in the bank than we do.
Or can they buy more?
Yeah. No, I mean, literally, in absolute terms, they're much wealthier.
Okay.
So, Australia, if you're an American, you have $79,000, and you work the very same job or career in Australia, you have a net worth of $282,000. Which would you rather have?
Wow.
That's who knew that America
I'll take the Australian one.
So now let's talk about politics instead of just economics here, because a lot changes in 1971 with politics as well. It's not just about debt and the gold standard. There's actually more to it than that. If you're a gold bug and you think it's just that we went off the gold standard. Well, the debt actually has causes that are not economic. They're cultural. You could even say that debt is not the cause of our problems. It's just a symptom, right?
Okay.
Over the last 4 or 5 decades, America has become essentially two nations. We talked about the two peoples in one country, and we can't agree on anything, right?
No kidding.
So that's really the cause. That's really the cause of our problems. What does it mean to be two nations, two people in one country? Well, okay, so one group of people believes in a thing called egalitarianism, that we should pursue equality in all things. The other group believes in something called, their worldview is something called complementarianism. That means people can be equal in moral worth, but still be functionally different and complementary, right? So this is where these two worldviews, this is where we get the divide in politics. We start having this divide between left and right. And you might think, oh, we've always had that. If you're a younger person, under 40, you've never seen a time, you've never known a time when America wasn't, if you weren't around when, say, Ronald Reagan, you wouldn't have ever known a time when America wasn't completely divided into two countries, two people, right?
You're right.
But this was not at all the case in the past.
Yeah.
Here's a perfect example. 1932 election, Roosevelt versus Hoover. All of America, but except for a few states, chooses Roosevelt. We all decide Roosevelt's the guy, right? 1972, Nixon versus McGovern. Obviously, everybody in America totally consensus. We all agree Nixon's the guy. One state disagrees. California, is all for Nixon. New York State, we can't even imagine this today. 1984 election, Ronald Reagan. Again,
Yes.
only one state goes for the other candidate. Everybody goes for the Republican, Ronald Reagan, right? California, New York State, you name it. Everybody, Massachusetts goes for Ronald Reagan, right? This is unthinkable, but this was only 1984. That wasn't that long ago.
No.
So this is you can see it on this chart. You can see that red arrow represents 1971,
Right.
and that's right where the positions of the major parties, which were very, very close, they were almost the same.
Yeah.
Prior to 1970,
I remember that was a complaint.
they start diverging.
Yeah.
They start diverging, and they just keep on diverging, ever more farther apart, ever after, right, until today. And so that's where you get this thing where every election we have, every damn election looks like this now, because it's not, we got two countries, and now we talk about people talking about civil war and all that stuff. And then you get stuff like this. Here's the Senate. This chart shows what's called cloture vote, and that means you shut down debate and you just vote. This chart here shows that from 1917 to 1970, it pretty much never happened. Everyone was allowed to debate as long as they wanted to on every bill.
So they convinced each other.
It was a gentleman's agreement, or whatever you want to call it.
So they convinced each other, basically.
Well, yeah, I guess so. At least they allowed
they were able to.
Everyone could talk and say, this bill sucks or whatever.
Yeah.
After 1971, this is how many cloture votes.
We're back to the Campbell soup.
That's funny. It looks like the Campbell soup chart. This is cloture voting in the Senate.
Yeah.
And there's the Campbell soup chart.
Yep. There it is.
How crazy. There's the Senate.
It's a little worse, actually. You see some way big peaks there, and the Campbell soup's not so big a peaky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. It's very crazy.
Yeah.
And that, and then you start beyond like economics and politics, and you start having, there's also cultural changes that are occurring. You probably remember this.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves. I like to teach the world to sing with me. Perfect harmony, perfect harmony. I like to buy the world a coat and keep it company. That's the real thing. I like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony, perfectly. And I'd like to buy the world a coat and keep it company.
Yeah, you remember that, right?
Yeah, I
Everybody
sure
who
do.
was around then remembers that.
Oh, it was like
it's called the most
all over.
seen advertisement in history. 1971 was also the year that John Lennon released the song "Imagine." We never stop hearing that song.
Yeah, no kidding.
And then also the song "Bye Bye Miss American Pie."
We were in the car and we learned that song by heart on the way to Ottawa.
It was a
our
long song.
first.
It was like 7 minutes long.
Yeah, well, it was like how many miles from little town to big city?
And the three men I admire most, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, they caught the last train for the coast the day the music died. This became sort of a weird, like, anti-anthem of America or something.
Yeah. Well, it had a nice, tune.
And
that really was my favorite song. It really.
1971 was also the year in television of something called the Rural Purge, where all at that time CBS pretty much dominated television, and all the shows that were like in the top 10 and whatever, they just suddenly canceled them all, and they changed them to completely different.
What's this about rules for fathers and sons?
There was a time, not that long ago, when primetime television in the U.S. looked a lot like this.
A ham for laughing.
But today, it looks a lot more like this.
I love you.
This shift can be traced back to a revolutionary moment in programming history over 50 years ago that forever changed television.
You know, I remember when they canceled they were all my favorite shows. I mean, it was like all of a sudden, one day, boom, we weren't watching Bonanza. We weren't
Green Acres, Hee Haw, the Beverly Hillbillies.
That's so weird.
So tons of changes to everything. I mean, it wasn't just these changes led to many more changes, and then gradually Americans' view of pretty much everything began to change. So you had changes in like people's view of, what is a family?
Oh yeah.
What is a man or a woman? What is college education for? Even the question, what is the purpose of life, basically went through a change, right?
Yes.
So let's look at some of this.
Okay.
What is a family? All right. So here's a Gallup poll taken for 65 years, 1934 to 1998 or whatever. The red arrow, 1971. 1971.
Wow,
the red
this
arrow
is
right
like
there.
a full flip.
Yeah, right there you can see this. It just completely flips. Those lines represent some people who say that what the ideal number of children for a family is.
Okay.
Either 3 or more, and then the lower line is 0 to 2, and then that lower line flips in the early 70s and becomes the dominant one. And now everyone's view of a family is the reverse. Now they believe 0 to 2 is the ideal, and 3 or more is like much less.
Quite a bit less.
Quite a bit less, yeah. We also had the rise of the unwed mothers. Of course, we all heard about that.
Yeah.
It kind of skyrocketed after 1971. In fact, so much so that America even became, or has become, the winner of the biggest single parenting country in the world. We have more single parenting than any place in the world, which I guess that's something to be proud of. But so essentially, unwed and single moms became the standard for the family today. In a sense, you had divorce, of course, was rising after 1970.
Wow.
And probably no surprise, the number of lawyers in America took off after that time.
Oh my gosh.
So that's great.
Of course.
And even fertility, you've heard of like the replacement level fertility. That means that how many you have to have in your country to continue to grow in the population of your country. So this red line, the point where we went below the replacement level, what year do you think that was?
1971.
1971 was the year we went below replacement level in population.
Mark, this is crazy.
Let's look at college education. We had males versus females. At the beginning in 1970, more males, a lot more males than females got a college degree. And then that began to just completely flip. And it literally just flipped like exactly. The women now have the same number of dominance in college degrees and men have the lower level that women used to have. It's weird. It's almost like a complete gender flip. Among married women, which spouse has more education? In 1970, the husband had 28%, or 28% had more education versus the wife was 20%. In 2007, it just flipped. The wife now has 28%, husband 19%. Here's a funny thing. Despite all this change, in marriages where women have more education than the man, they're 93% more likely to marry men with higher incomes than themselves. 93% more likely. So that begs a big question. All that money spent on education, it's not ending up in higher incomes, at least not to the extent that that women are not able to marry men who have now spent a lot less on education. Their education spending has gone way down.
Right.
But they're still making more than women, apparently, because women are 93% more likely to marry a man with all that education that they have. They're still 93% more likely to marry a man with higher education than themselves. Kind of makes you wonder what's going on with all that money for education. All right. So let's look at just the divide between the sexes generally, right? Because this became obviously a big thing.
Yep.
After the 60s. You have politically, let's just take a look at who votes for who.
Okay.
All right. So this is the map, if only men voted, this is who they would vote for, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is who they vote for.
Mm-hmm.
If only women voted, this is who they vote for. So if only men voted, only one party would always win, and if only women voted, only one party would always win. There'd never be a time.
That's really interesting. That means we're against each other.
Well, it's almost like two countries.
Yeah. No, but in the relationship,
broke down to women and men. That's how fun is that? Let's look at the next one. What is the purpose of life?
Okay.
You don't really expect that to change along with, economic stuff and whatever. But so there's a poll taken at UCLA since 1966 of all the incoming freshmen. Okay. It asks students to rate the things which are of greatest importance to them, like developing a meaningful philosophy of life. That's a big high one. Helping others, becoming an authority, raising a family. The lowest one, oddly enough, was being very well off financially. And this is before 1971.
Oh.
But then after 1971, there's some big changes here. So take a look and watch the thick green line.
Yeah.
So the thick green line starts out the lowest, and that's being very well off financially. The blue line starts out the highest. That's developing a meaningful philosophy of life. And those just switch. The blue line goes down to the bottom. The green line goes up to the top. So being very well off becomes, after 1971, becomes everybody's goal.
Yeah.
Right. And they don't really care about something like meaningful philosophy of life. What is that? Right. So this weird shift. You can see how that affected politics, actually.
Yes.
Here's what people care about. Here's the issues people care about in politics and presidential elections. You got things like foreign affairs, economy, crime, civil rights. And those are, they go up and down different times. But they're all issues that people care about. But this chart only goes up to 1970. And then you look at after 1970. The red arrow on the bottom is 1971. And the big red arrow is pointing to this yellow line. That's economy.
Oh,
and you can see that line just soars and becomes the sort of dominant, whereas all the others go to almost zero.
The old saying, "It's the economy, stupid," really started there then.
Yeah, totally. The economy becomes the only issue Americans care about. And yet there's plenty of things to care about, right? I mean, just take example like incarceration rates in America. This is 1925 to 1971. Not a huge problem, but then after 1971, boom.
Wow.
But only apparently all people only care about the economy because the crime interest doesn't go up very much, right? People act like they don't even notice this. Apparently, it's just how's the economy doing? Okay, and even mass shootings had their rise after 1971.
Whoa! Can we get anything positive? Is everything negative now?
Right.
This is horrible.
Okay, well, actually, there is something. This is a good time to go. There is something positive that we can talk about here. So we're going to talk about the cycle of polarization, debt, and war, right? So it's important to recognize that we've been here before, basically. That's if there's anything positive, we can at least accept that we've been here before in America. We've actually been here 3 times before. We've had this kind of crushing debt. We've had, the Civil War, let's face it, people were dying in across all of America. That's a absurdly bad place compared to where we are now. So we've been here before. We've been here 3 times before. This chart shows clearly. This is all the way back to the beginning. Each red line represents the peak of debt. We've definitely been here before.
Yeah, I can see that.
We had the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II. Each time we had unsustainable debt.
Okay, but where's the war this time? If
we don't have a war this time? Yeah. Of course, it's true. We don't have we have the debt, but we don't have anything like any of these wars. And that's a big question. But so here's a possibility. And it's something called the war on poverty. Lyndon Johnson in 1960s began something called the War on Poverty.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. And I urge.
All right. This was a massive program, bigger than anything before in American history in terms of like, I mean, not even close. I mean, it was just, it's unimaginably large government program. There hadn't been really big government programs prior to this time. And this was, we had a poverty rate of 22% in 1960, right?
Yes.
And the idea was, oh, we were going to eliminate poverty. But one thing we did do is we spent a ton of money. So we spent more than all the wars in American history combined on the war on poverty.
Okay, but isn't
World War II is tiny compared to this spending.
But isn't that great? We spent all that money on helping people rather than on war, right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously,
so
better than war. But there's definitely a problem, right? The war on poverty didn't do a very good job of reducing poverty. It was
we still have to help the poor, right? I mean, you got.
Yeah. I mean, you got to understand. We're talking, when I say it didn't do a very good job, I mean that. So take a look at this graph here. So recently, the Biden administration sort of trumpeted that we had reached a new record low in poverty, right? Well, that sounds great. But when was the last time we had the record low? Well, it was 1973. We haven't gone down below that 1973 until now.
Yeah,
just
at least
now.
it's not 1971.
the reducing poverty actually was being reduced for many years prior to 1970, the early 70s, right? And then it just stopped going down. It stayed at that 16% or whatever level since they started spending all that money, and it's never gone down below.
So it flatlined.
It just stayed flat. So we've spent more money than all the wars combined, but it hasn't done anything at all to reducing poverty. So you can see this. You've got the first yellow arrow, $5 trillion for World War II created that level of debt. And my thesis here is that the war on poverty, it seems reasonable to me to say, if we believe that this 5 trillion created this, and these are in absolute dollars, constant dollars. So if that's 5 trillion created this World War II debt, don't we kind of have to accept that it's pretty possible, likely, that this $22 trillion created this debt that we have now, right? That doesn't sound crazy. So in other words, it may be that the war on poverty unintentionally acted as the equivalent of the same kind of issues that caused a rise in polarization and debt in the past cycles in America, right? Now, here is some good news.
Yes.
If this acted like, if this thing of this war on poverty, if it acted like a quote, a war, then it might also end the same way that other wars have ended. Now, how did other wars end? Well, if you look back, you will see that all of the major wars in American history have ended decisively. This is kind of unique to America. I'm talking about the major wars, not any small wars. The major wars in America have ended decisively. The belligerent party has always made a full and permanent surrender. So, for example, the British monarchists, right? The South in the Civil War, the Axis powers in World War II. When it ended, it ended. We didn't keep fighting the Southerners, or there weren't like runs on the into the North. It just ended and it was over. So the political and moral order that the belligerent party stood for was vanquished at the end of the war. You never heard anything about what they stood for after that time, at least not in any mainstream anything.
Well, you mean like the good.
And then beyond that, debt after the end of each war, debt reduced quickly, and even with not a lot of effort. So here you see the same chart. These green lines represent how fast, show you how fast the debt came down, right?
That would be nice.
That's really good. Well, you'd have to have another one of these green lines at the end here.
Right.
And this last red line would have to have a green line right after it, and we'd have to see debt just come right down, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you might, well, how in the world is that going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if America is going to survive, we're going to need to see another one of these. It's going to have to take like 20 years, like the next 20 years.
You mean
we'd have to see the debt come down in the next 20 years, right? Like
at a high speed?
Yeah, at a high speed.
I think that would be very good.
It would be, but it's like, how is that going to happen?
Yeah.
So the question is, we've got this war going on, like people talk about a culture war. Everything is apocalyptic, language.
I know.
Clearly that has to end in order for the debt to come down dramatically, right?
Oh, yes.
So what's going to bring this to an end? This state that we're in right now. All right, well, let's look at past periods.
Okay.
So here we've got way back, beginning of America, the war of the monarchy versus the republic.
Okay.
There's different phases of that, right? Ending in the Revolutionary War. You got, there we go. Civil War, slavery versus abolition.
Yep.
The next one, World War II, dictatorship versus democracy.
Yep.
And now you have the one that we are involved in today. We and our parents grew up with, this is what we're familiar with. Cold War, different, it began with us being very concerned about the communists, right? Soviet Union.
Yep.
Let's look at those different periods in this latest one that we're in, this latest cycle that we're in. So the first one you get is the 1950s, communism versus anti-communism. This was on everybody's mind. The spread of communism was the biggest fear that everyone had.
Yes, I can see it.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist.
May Day brings a wave of anti-communist sentiment as 100,000 march down New York's Fifth Avenue in a loyalty parade. Everyone from vets to youngsters reveals his inborn dislike of communism.
All right, so things were very, very, very different from today. For one thing, corporations, we have a lot of corporations are very involved in social issues today. Well, they were very involved in social issues back then, just in a completely different way. Here's an ad campaign. This is Two magazine ad campaign. The theme of this was, do we actually know where to face communism? And they talk about, one is got communism and twisted education. It talks about, communists in education. The other one is communism and Christianity and communism in our churches. It's almost impossible to believe what, let's read one of these, right? Imagine Google or Starbucks or something talking like this. Communism and twisted education. In the eyes of communists, a child is simply something to be warped into one shape. Godless, ignorant of moral responsibility, devoid of intellectual honesty, a creature of the state. In its drive for world power, communism has found it's most profitable to influence teachers and alter textbooks, to use the intimate bond between teacher and scholar to spread doubts about the old ways and Christian ethics, to insinuate ideas of atheism, regimentation, and false idealism in their place. We parents and teachers alike need to be on our guard to keep our children free from communism. Wasted would be all other defenses, navies, armies, air forces, if communism could take the citadel from within. And this is a Canadair. That's basically like Boeing in America.
Yeah.
Huge company. And you saw this all over the place. That was the level of the tenor of what people were hearing. in the 1950s.
Yeah, they were large. Canadair was the.
Yeah. No, we're talking literally like the biggest companies in the world. This is the type of things they were talking about in their advertising and whatnot. Next, 1960s, the sexual revolution. Of course, peace and love and all that stuff. The leader of the sexual revolution, or the New Left, was Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse, in a nutshell, was blending Freudianism and Marxism. His message essentially was that America was semi-fascist. Next was 1970s, feminism, all about the equality of men and women, obviously. The intellectual leader of that group was
Simone de Beauvoir.
Simone de Beauvoir. And she was married to Sartre, which is, pretty crazy. Simone de Beauvoir once said, feminism is a revolutionary movement, a movement which must be leftist. By that I mean at the extreme left, a movement working to overthrow the whole society. Does that mean feminism was essentially Marxist? No, but definitely revolutionary. I mean, that was everybody was saying that's what it was. It wasn't, we didn't have to sit here and have conspiracy theories about it. I mean, now, does that mean that they were for violent overthrow, or was she speaking metaphorically? Yeah, I mean, she's speaking metaphorically, but it's still the idea of changing the whole society. So that is the goal. That was the goal. Next is woke capitalism, which is what we've been going through in the last 10 years, I suppose. That's one way of putting that, is the pursuit of equity and inclusion.
Yeah.
There are various things that's mostly it. It's the idea that equality isn't enough. You need equity. You've got big companies.
Yes.
All involved in this sort of social messaging.
Yeah.
It didn't used to be a thing, although, I mean, it was a thing back in the 1950s. It was completely different. Disney, pride parades and all this kind of stuff. So in every previous war in America, if you look at the different who's on which side, one side represented the continuance of a norm that was no longer being accepted, a social and moral norm that people thought, like slavery, what people no longer thought that was acceptable. And so we had this war. And the monarchy, Americans didn't want monarchy anymore. Slavery, Americans didn't want slavery anymore. Dictatorship, now we want a democracy. This is how these cycles in American history, this is how they go. It's always something over a moral issue. Now, the last thing we need to ask ourselves is, who was the establishment? Was it the left? Was right after 1943 in America? Which party was the dominant party? Which group was the establishment? Because every single time, every single cycle, it was the established party with the most, influence in America. That was the belligerent, basically. All right. Well, we can answer the question of who was the most powerful party. Definitively. Let's look at the history, right? So this is the control of the U.S. House and Senate going all the way back to 1855. The reddish rectangle there is when Republicans controlled. The bluish areas where Democrats controlled. And one really interesting thing is that we were talking about how you have to have 60 votes in the Senate.
Right.
Well, there's only been two periods in the last, since before the Civil War. There's only been two periods where major legislation has been enacted in America. And that's, you can see on these little black circles here. That was right after the Civil War. And right when the Great Depression happened. Those are the only two times, and one was Republican. They controlled everything in the Senate and the House. And then during the Great Depression, the Democrats controlled everything in the Senate and the House, and they were able to enact these America-changing legislation, right? You also have, at the ending period of a cycle, you have a time when no one has enough power to make any legislation. So these black circles represent the ending phase, and nobody's got 60 votes, even close. Nobody can do anything. And so the period just before, like in the 1920s, everyone was complaining about how it was a do-nothing Congress, it was gridlock, just like we have been today.
Yeah.
No difference.
Yeah.
All right. Now you might think interesting correlations. But why should we believe this is truly? I mean, this isn't a scientific thing.
Right.
There isn't enough data here to be a scientific model. So it's interesting, but how do we know it's going to repeat? Right. Well, one reason is because these time periods are very similar. I'm not going to say eerily similar, but they are very similar. So let's look. These are the period. These are the general periods leading up to the wars, and then you look at just the turning points of the wars. So 1783, 1863, 1943.
80 years.
Yeah, it's 80 years between the first group, 80 years between the next group, and it's exact, right? I mean, I'm not trying to do like numerology here or something, but it is. I'm just saying there's something intriguing that these are so close, right? So the next time would be 2023. If you had the end of a cycle, right? It would be next year.
Okay, so you're saying,
and you think, oh yeah, well, so what? But we did. It's true. We have reached a record high in debt exactly within the 80-year time frame that we were supposed to.
Yeah.
If you wanted to demonstrate that, here's that chart again. I got a yellow line here, and if you were to take that and copy and paste it, right? Boom, it's exactly the same. You can see, just visually, you can see. Copy and paste it again, boom, and it's the same, right?
Yep.
I think that's interesting.
It's encouraging.
I think that's interesting. So let's say you're not convinced, but you do find it intriguing, and your question might be, okay, if this cycle is true, what comes next? Okay, that's a natural question. It would be interesting. What would come next? Well, here we go. So if history were to be, repeat itself, you would see the changes over just the next couple of decades. You would see polarization would be reduced to an insignificant level. In other words, America would become one nation again. As with monarchy, slavery, dictatorship, these historical, periods, if history were repeated, and I suppose you could think this is a good thing or a bad thing, but one example would be we would no longer ever hear in the mainstream anybody referring to Marxism or socialism positively ever again.
Wow.
And I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying from history, we never heard about monarchy again. We never heard about slavery again. We never heard about dictatorship again.
Positively, you mean?
Yeah, from the mainstream,
Yeah.
And so since this period was about communism versus anti-communism, then nothing associated about that. Okay, so you might say that's really unlikely. But of course, if you look back at 1943 in the middle of the World War II, people would say that's pretty unlikely then too. Or 1863. Now let's talk about what happens to the debt, this unsustainable debt that no one has any solution for. We know that it's happened before. We know that it has gone down before, but how does that happen?
Yes.
Right? I mean, well, what happens is that the economy at the beginning of a cycle expands at a level that is unlike any other time period.
Okay.
So to get an idea of the growth of the economy, let's look at after the Civil War. So in 1850, there were 9,000 miles of railroads.
Excellent.
By 1890, just 40 years later, there were 163,000 miles of railroads. And in 10 years, between 1880 and 1890, there were 70,000 miles laid just in 10 years. That's so the economy then was just like, I mean, really, really red hot. It's just exploding. Next, let's look at our time period from more recent, 1945 to 1974. Just 29 years, the economy doubled during that time. The size of the economy completely doubled. The next time it doubled, it took 43 years, right after 74. So huge growth. That just basically means in 20 years will dwarf the size of the economy today. and that will make the debt just not an issue. As hard as it is to imagine, it's not an issue. Even more surprising, there's going to be an explosion in new births, like huge.
Okay.
Like the baby boom, right? So these are the two last times we had baby booms. We had one after World War II. Well, we had one after the Civil War too. Huge, right? So that's what happens when it's over, when the war period is over. You can even see, this is odd, you can see this is the control of the Senate and the House when the legislation was done. Well, those black circles there, those represent the very same years that the baby booms are happening, right? So this here, the very same years as that there.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a natural way that it repeats. All right. Well, is there an 80-year historical cycle? Well, we will find out. We will find out pretty soon, actually. So maybe not. Maybe the debt will just be like this.
Oh,
right. So, or you can believe in this crazy theory, right?
Well, I think I'll pick your theory. All right. Well, if you enjoyed what you've just heard, or would like to at least consider looking at more of this, you just smash the like button, hit that bell, subscribe, and have yourself a great day.
Bye-bye.